Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro instant. For you, hate.
Harlan Ellison. His works total in the thousands, across many different genres and artistic mediums. He's known for his biting science fiction, intense bravado, and outspoken nature.
Somebody said, who made Harlan Ellison the conscience of science fiction? Who appointed him? And Mike Jurek tried to be polite about it, but I got the answer for you. You did, Pinhead.
His stories could be disturbing, whimsical, or even downright cruel, but they were all distinctly his. He's been nominated for and won an absurd amount of awards. He sued James Cameron. He's sued quite a lot of people, actually. He mailed Ace Books a dead gopher when they refused to honor his contract. He described himself as a troublemaker, malcontent, and desperado. Fellow author Robert Bloch called him the only living organism I know whose natural habitat is hot water. However, I think he can only truly be described in 2 words. Harlan Ellison. Ellison's works are widely known, and for many sci-fi fans it's hard to pick a favorite. He wrote the teleplay for the Star Trek episode The City on the Edge of Forever, often considered one of the best episodes in the entire franchise. He's known for his cycle of short stories, A Boy and His Dog, as well as the story Repent Harlequin, said the TikTok Man. As iconic as those pieces of fiction may be, today I'll be focusing on perhaps his most famous piece of work, I Have No Mouth, and I Must Scream. This video is primarily focusing on the 1995 video game adaptation, though I'm going to be covering the original short story and its other adaptations as well. This video will contain spoilers for all versions of the story, so keep that in mind before watching.
Sam is playing a dangerous game here, and not just dangerous to you, but dangerous to himself as well. Hey, it disappeared. What kind of game is Am playing this time?
To get a broader context for the game and its many sister adaptations, I think it's important we take a look at the short story that started it all. Legend has it that Harlan Ellison had penned the first 6 or so pages before presenting them to Frederick Pohl Jr., a fellow sci-fi writer. Pohl was so impressed by Ellison's work that he paid him in advance to complete it. Ellison hunkered down for a single night, finishing his story with very few, if any, changes from his initial draft. Pohl would do some rewriting of his own, tweaking some aspects of the characters. In March of 1967, the story would finally be published in If, a sci-fi magazine from Quinn Publications. The story would prove popular among readers, even earning Ellison a Hugo Award the following year. Some sources even claim it to be one of the most reprinted stories in the English language. What makes the story most interesting to me is how well it reflects the era in which it was written. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had been in full swing for nearly 2 decades. Due to the increasing complexity of warfare, now taking the form of proxies, threats, and missile technology rather than the direct confrontations of World War II, new technology had to be developed to make it all the more feasible. Computers had now progressed from being powered by vacuum tubes to proper integrated circuit chips, which had become both more stable and economical. Suddenly, computers, a thing that sci-fi writers would have only dreamed of a short 10 years ago, were in our governments, in our militaries, and at least theoretically, running our wars. These events no doubt inspired many writers, and Ellison was no exception. The story's world setting is defined by Ellison speculating on the potential negative consequences of such technological developments, and venting his frustrations at the behavior of mankind. In I Have No Mouth, the Cold War has evolved into a full-blown World War III, becoming so impossibly complicated that it becomes entirely unmanageable by human hands. To prolong the conflict, each of the major powers builds its own allied master computer. However, things go awry when one of the master computers gains sentience, absorbs the others, and launches an all-out attack on the human race. After the surface has been irreparably damaged, the newly christened Am, now referencing I think, therefore I am, drags the last 5 humans deep underground, where his ghastly medical experiments render them immortal, and he tortures them for 109 years. The short story follows the perspective of Ted, a delusional and paranoid man, and the youngest of the 5, as he and Gorister, Benny, Ellen, and Nimdok traverse the underground computer labyrinth battered and starved, aimlessly in search of food promised by Am. Ted's perspective lends the story an incredibly disturbing angle, as his paranoia makes it difficult to properly ascertain what is real and what's simply a product of his tormented mind. It infects the reader, and I felt like I was going mad alongside the group. It makes for a unique protagonist that embodies the story's nightmarish atmosphere. Ellison captures the feeling of madness with his prose very well, describing things in detail without being unnecessarily complicated, and even bending prose beyond what would normally be considered professional to emphasize Ted's sanity slippage. His intense distrust of others, his feeling of self-superiority, and his vitriolic misogyny against Ellen show that Am has deeply scarred his mind. Speaking of Am, the big computer himself is hardly ever seen, only described. He only speaks twice throughout the story and remains omnipotently horrifying. Am is like a ruthless, pitiless, unfeeling god, even appearing to the group as a burning bush, mirroring the Book of Exodus, where God takes the form of one to command Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Most consider it to be a fairly depressing tale, and I mean, they're not wrong, but although the fates of the 5 are undoubtedly terrible, I think there's a uniquely human undercurrent throughout the story. When the stalactites fall and Ted plunges them into his friends, he begs to himself that their faces are of gratitude and not fear. I could not read meaning into her expression. The pain had been too great, had contorted her face, but it might have been thank you. It's possible, please. Ted may have killed them, but he instead refers to this as saving them. While death is undoubtedly a horrible outcome, most would argue it is superior to another 109 years of torment at the hands of the Mad Machine. While one could interpret Ted's final actions as selfish and self-aggrandizing, I choose to believe that Ted, in his final moments as a human, learned to feel compassion for his fellow man, pulling them out of their misery. One last giant middle finger to the god and the machine, signed with love from the indomitable human spirit. The story is dripping with atmosphere, and Ellison's description leaves nothing to the imagination, painting a perfectly macabre picture in your head. You'll feel the flapping of a giant bird's wings, you'll feel the heat of the path of the boiling steam, and you'll feel your mind slowly slipping away from you. I found how the story expressed the fears, subtext, and world events of the late 1960s fascinating, and the actual story it told was engrossing and immersive. Needless to say, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite stories of all time. But how do the adaptations fare?
Mother ugly machine. Mission worth undertaking. So it brings me here, junkyard, electronic pyramid nowhere, and yellow. Always yellow. Why does yellow make me sweat?
The first released adaptation was the graphic novel, which was released as part of the comic book anthology series Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor, spread out throughout 4 issues. Ellison, or at least the caricature of him at the beginning of Dream Corridor, chose comic artist John Byrne to adapt the story due to his special, exemplary vision. Byrne is of course no small fry, having had his hands in many superhero properties throughout the years, and is perhaps most famous for relaunching the Superman franchise in 1986 with his limited series The Man of Steel. While I cannot give a lot of details regarding the production, as not many exist, I can say that this is a pretty alright adaptation. The biggest boon here is Byrne's artwork, which is vibrant and colorful without ruining the cold, nightmarish atmosphere of the story. Despite the color, Byrne uses a lot of cross-hatching, perhaps an excessive amount, which makes everything look dingy and dilapidated. It does a good job of conveying differences in lighting without necessarily bathing everything in shadow, even if I personally would have used a little more of the latter. I also love how he poses the characters, such as Benny's dramatic stance during the blinding sequence, which gives them a lot of dynamism. making them feel more complex and realistic. I thought the way Byrne interpreted AIMS computer labyrinths as formless rectangular masses of steel and computer towers to be exactly how I had imagined it, and there's a good sense of scale to it all. However, the scene where Ted is pushed around by the winds of AIMS manifestations looks very strange, and if you're not familiar with the short, it's unclear what's going on. The main problem with the comic adaptation, however, is that Byrne, who I believe also wrote, please correct me if I'm wrong, is heavily dedicated to being accurate to the source material. You might be thinking, well, that's good, isn't it? Why would accuracy be a problem? Well, the problem is he's too accurate. One thing to keep in mind when adapting a story to another medium is that you need to play to the strengths of said new medium, and inherent changes will need to be made. What works in a short story doesn't necessarily in a comic, and I feel like this is a good example of that. Most of the story's narrative and world setting is conveyed through Ted's internal monologue, and translating that to a more visual medium can be difficult. Unfortunately, it seems they took the simple route by converting his monologue verbatim into the dialogue, which comes off as incredibly stilted. People simply do not speak how Ellison writes descriptive text, and that's ever so evident while reading. It's never enough to ruin the comic, and in fact there's still a decent amount of visual storytelling throughout. But when Ted starts suddenly dumping exposition onto characters who would already reasonably know it, it comes off as servicing the reader rather than actual people talking to one another. This technically happened in the original short too, but there was always some sort of narrative justification. Not so here. Comics are a medium ripe for artists and editors to experiment with unconventional storytelling and structure, but Byrne and his team seem content to just replicate the short story as much as possible. And you know what? To some degree, I think there's something to respect about that. I just don't think the approach worked out as well as it could have at the end of the day. The comic adaptation is still pretty decent, mind you. The detailed, colorful, and grim artwork sets the tone well, and writing issues aside, it still does a pretty okay job capturing the madness of the original short. If you're not familiar with the short, I feel like this comic will do absolutely nothing for you, but if you're a fan like myself, it's still a brisk and enjoyable read overall. Unfortunately, Dream Corridor is long out of circulation, but it seems to go for very low costs on eBay, and if that is still unattainable, well, I'm sure you know how to find it.
You son of a bitch! You've cleared my mind but crippled my legs. I can barely walk.
Next, I'd like to briefly discuss the audiobook adaptation. Normally I wouldn't talk about something like an audiobook. In most cases, I just don't think I'd have a whole lot to say about one, and generally I just prefer reading a hard copy myself. However, there is one aspect of this production that pushed it over the edge for me, and that was the narration. Harlan Ellison himself narrated the audiobook, and he's no passive reader. It was recorded in 1999 as part of Fantastic Audio's series The Voice from the Edge, which featured Ellison reading many of his classic stories. Ellison has often been praised for his skills as a narrator, even being nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Spoken Word Album for Children for his reading of Through the Looking Glass. Let me put it this way, this is the most psychotic book narration I've ever heard.
We saw the stack of canned goods, and we tried to run to them. We fell in the snow, and we got up and went on, and Benny shoved us away, and went at them, and pawed them, and gummed them, and gnawed at them, and he could not open them. Am had not given us a tool to open the cans!
The audiobook feels like how Ellison truly intended his story to be read. His narration swings through the entire spectrum of human emotions, a wide gamut that for me at least meant I was never zoning out. It doesn't read like a descriptive overview of an author's prose, but rather an emotional, flaming, and bitter recount of a man's own experience of being tortured and maimed for over a century. You really get the sense that Ellison had immersed himself in his own story, which does wonders for my own experience. voice. What I particularly like is his range and how rapidly he can switch between different vocal tones and expressions. Reprising his role as Am, who he had also played in the game, don't worry, we'll get there, his performance as the Mad AI is markedly different. While his performance was more fluid and expressive in the game, similar to Ellison's own speaking patterns, his performance here is more traditionally robotic, emphasizing monotone punctuation.
Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live.
While this isn't bad by any means, it feels oddly cheesy in an otherwise nightmarish reading, as it comes off as a little bit like any other cheesy evil robot. That aside, this is a fantastic audiobook, and easily one of my favorite ways of experiencing the story. Although the original cassette tapes are long out of print, it can easily be found on YouTube for free.
Video screens. Each one shows a scene of some other place. Why? What mystery does Am want me to solve?
Before I cover the video game, there's one last adaptation I'd like to take a look at. Harlan Ellison's short story was adapted for the airwaves by Mike Walker, who was no stranger to adapting classic literature, having done Neuromancer and Crime and Punishment in the past. Directed by Ned Chalier and starring David Soul of Starsky and Hutch fame, it was broadcast on BBC Radio 4 in 2002. This is one of the more interesting adaptations, and it's interesting to see the parallels between this and the other versions. Evidently, it takes some influence from the game, such as Nimdoc being explicitly German, and Ellison's performance is more reminiscent of the game than the audiobook. What I like most about this adaptation is how natural the character interactions feel. Chalier directs the actors with an almost Howard Hawks-esque approach to overlapping dialogue, and unlike the Byrne comic, the characters feel like they're having actual conversations and reacting based on the events rather than just simply spouting exposition. While listening to it, I was almost immediately pulled into the story, not just as a reader or a listener, but as an active participant in the narrative. There's a bit around the fire where Ted makes an offhand remark, "I am what I am," and Nimdoc responds, "Popeye."
I am what I am. Popeye.
Two people reminiscing on a long-lost cultural reference they share, or how when ranting to the group about his insecurities, Ted immediately breaks into apologetic tears and begs for Ellen to hold him.
Hold me,
None of it matters.
hold me.
Interactions like that may seem minor on paper, but they go a long way in making these characters feel real, and these moments genuine. The voice performances are generally great too. There were very few moments when I felt unconvinced, and Soul himself particularly kills it. In fact, I'd argue that Nimdoc's voice actor is superior to the one they used in the game, as he sounds more like a natural German and less like someone putting on an accent, though I don't dislike the game performance by any means. As I said earlier, Ellison's performance as Am is closer to the game than the audiobook, but he seems to put a little more sly, evil bitterness into the role this time. It's hard to describe, and I wouldn't say it bests the game version, but it's a pretty cool take on the character.
In the backyard with the kids. Ted, remember those little babies?
No!
Why not? I snap my fingers, click, and they are gone.
Finally, the sound effects add a lot to the production. The sounds of echoing footsteps down a steel corridor, Benny's screams as a distant electronic drone materializes above him, a crackling fire as the five rest and eat. It's certainly well done Foley, and listening to this in the dark on a pair of headphones proves to be a rather immersive experience. I love this adaptation of the short story and consider it one of the best, offering a unique experience that is still faithful to the source material. It's been re-uploaded to YouTube, so there's no reason not to try it. Finally, we've made it to the video game, perhaps the most interesting adaptation of them all. The game would be developed by two different studios. Cyberdreams, which was known for the Dark Seed games, would handle script writing, game design, and other various pre-production tasks. Main production would be handled by the Dreamers Guild, known for Fairy Tale Adventures 2, Hall of the Dead, and Dinotopia, and was largely responsible for the programming and art side of development. The game's release date is a bit of a contentious topic, with multiple sources giving conflicting dates. Both Wikipedia and Game Informer claim the game was released for DOS PCs and classic macOS on October 31st of 1995. However, an MGM Interactive press release from around that era cites the DOS release as November 17th, with the Mac port slated to arrive in early 1996. Either way, the game was released for DOS and Mac around that time period. Surprisingly, you would see a variety of ports as well, such as Windows, Mac OS X, and Linux in 2013, and iOS and Android in 2016. Developing a game based on I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream of all things was certainly a challenging task. David Sears, one of the game's lead designers and writers, was met with uncertainty from his game development peers when told of the project, allegedly being told, "Oh, I love Ellison's stories, but there's no way you could turn that into a game." To which he thought, wow, what have I gotten into? One of the largest hurdles was the story. How do you turn a story in which the entire cast is either mutated or killed into a video game? Ellison had been heavily involved in development despite his recorded hatred for video games.
The extent of my gaming experience is that coming back from England, I played Jurassic Park for 3 wasted hours on a plane, on a TV set about this big. And at the end of 3 hours, I said, how can people spend years doing this? It is an utter and absolute stupid waste of time.
When asked by Sears why exactly Am was torturing these 5 specific people, Ellison was stumped. He had never once questioned that concept. Realizing that this was exactly the springboard they needed, Sears and Ellison sprang to work, brainstorming detailed backstories for the 5 playable characters. Ellison wanted each character's backstory to embody a controversial theme, seeking to explore sensitive concepts such as rape, genocide, and guilt. Ellison and Sears allegedly hit it off very well, sharing many common topics of interests, with the latter describing the former as a real rascal with a heart of gold. At some point during development, Sears left the project, being replaced with David Mullick, who had previously gained a positive reputation for his groundbreaking adventure game The Prisoner, released for the Apple II and based on the 1960s television series of the same name. Unfortunately, Sears didn't exactly clean his tracks. By the time he departed, only about half of the design document had been fleshed out, and significantly more work was needed before the game could properly move into the production phase. Mullick was responsible for fleshing out and expanding upon a lot of Sears' original dialogue into full branching pathways, and logically working through the puzzles described in the original document. For the puzzles, he wanted to avoid the moon logic often seen in adventure games. He wanted to make sure that each step had some sort of relevant psychological meaning, with the context clues laid out to the player via NPC dialogue and through the cultural encyclopedia, an in-game item that provides clues at specific moments. Unlike his relatively amicable relationship with Sears, Ellison and Mullick initially got off on the wrong foot, with the former referring to him as another one of the Cyberdreams brain trust, and mocking him for being unable to find an inconspicuously placed power outlet. One of Ellison's major goals going into development was to create a game that one could not possibly win, ironically something he had criticized the Atari 2600 adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back for, but one which you could fail ethically. If you played your cards right and made the right ethical choices, you could at least fail with your humanity intact. When the game finally shipped, it did include a good ending, albeit one that was an intense pain to achieve, at least according to most players. Ellison reportedly had no problem with this, or at least never voiced any concerns. A lot of thought was put into the writing, especially the character writing, which would be the lifeblood of the story. Part of Ellen's backstory is that she had been raped in an elevator after work by a man disguised as a repair worker.
To your horror, he inserted his key into the control panel and locked the elevator.
I'm back, Ellen.
During her campaign, she's forced to confront a manifestation of the man in a distorted and monstrous form. Both Ellison and Mullock pulled from their personal experiences to make the sequence more effective. Mullock pulled from his memories of his infant son undergoing chemotherapy, spending late nights in the hospital room to keep him company, always sharing it with another patient. One night, they had shared a room with a teenage girl, who unfortunately knew her chances were not in her favor, waking up petrified, only calmed down by speaking to a nurse. He internalized that memory during the late nights he spent writing, trying to put himself in Ellen's shoes and the terror she must have felt confronting her rapist. Ellison pulled from the experiences of his female friends, who once told him that riding an elevator with a man was often a uniquely terrifying experience, as she has no way of knowing if he's going to the third floor to the doctor's office or if he's going to take advantage of her. A particular difficulty during the design process was Ellison's lack of experience with game design. During Gorrister's campaign, there's a part where he finds his wife and mother-in-law impaled on meat hooks in a hidden freezer, and to solve the puzzle, the player had to take them off the hook, metaphorically symbolizing Gorrister forgiving his family for their past transgressions. Ellison was under the impression that he had concocted a brilliant puzzle. Mullock had to break it to him that that would be one of the first things that gamers would think to do, having become accustomed to clicking on everything everywhere. As said earlier, Cyberdreams functioned more as a pre-production house on the project rather than a full development studio, with most of it handled by the Dreamers Guild, as Mullock considered their engine, Scripts for Animated Graphic Adventures, or Saga, ideal due to its nuanced user interface. Ellison was known for his vivid imagination, so the art team, led by art directors Peter Delgado and Bradley W. Schneck, drew from a wide variety of sources. After all, if a mad god can produce things directly from its mind, why limit yourself strictly to steel corridors? From classical fantasy to old German expressionist films, it was considered essential that high-resolution SVGA graphics were necessary to appropriately showcase the art team's work, with technical director John Bolton adapting the engine to compensate. Assistant art director Glenn Price and his team used a number of both two-dimensional and three-dimensional toolsets, such as Deluxe Paint and Lightwave, painting and rendering over 60 different backgrounds that make up the game's disturbing canvas. When the game finally did release, it was a critical success, receiving high praise for its handling of deep and disturbing themes. However, according to Dreamers Guild staff member Joe Pierce, it was a modest seller and failed to turn a profit. The game saw quite a bit of controversy in France and Germany, being the subject of censorship, seeing as Nimdok's campaign takes place in a Nazi concentration camp. Nimdok's entire campaign was removed, likely so the game could be sold there at all. There's been an unsubstantiated claim over the years that this makes the good ending impossible to achieve, as Nimdok, not existing in these versions, cannot enter his passcode of 1945 into the pit terminal. This isn't true, however, as Dreamers Guild did allow for most of the characters to simply guess Nimdok's passcode in the censored versions, at least according to recent discoveries online.
Une seconde. Ham n'avait-il pas dit que nous ne devrions jamais oublier 1945? Mot de passe correct. Accès au menu principal. Tout droit. Quelle chaleur!
When it came to adapting the game's story, Harlan Ellison, David Sears, and David Mullock all contributed in some form or fashion. Mullock estimates that 20% of the game was written by Ellison himself, and the remaining 80% was split equally between him and Sears. Regardless of who did what, the game's script is vastly different from the original short story. While the initial premise remains the same, the scenario still focuses on the last 5 humans brought underground to be tormented for 109 years, the scenario itself, and especially the character writing, have been almost entirely altered. The original short is less concerned with a conventional narrative, whisking the characters around at Ellison's demand to create a nightmarish and deranged atmosphere. The game, however, starts with a challenge, a dare, so to speak. As the 5 gather around Am's smoking pillar of hate, he challenges them to a game. A nice game, he says.
Which of you 5 would like to play my little game?
Each of the 5 has been given a quest. If Gorrister solves Am's riddles, he will finally be allowed to kill himself. Nimdok must find the lost tribe, so he can continue his research. If Benny submits to his bestial desires, he will finally be allowed to eat. If Ted solves the puzzles of the Room of Dark, he will be allowed to return to the surface world. If Ellen finds Am's original components, she will destroy him permanently. Unfortunately, these quests will not be easy, as each character is subjected to a personalized psychodrama, where their darkest fears and deepest insecurities manifest in physical form. The characters are markedly different from their original iterations. Gorrister used to be a peace marcher, an idealist turned apathetic, but now he's a southern truck driver who blames himself for his wife's institutionalization. Benny was a genius homosexual scientist warped into a simian with enormous genitals, having lost his sanity and regressed to a childlike state. In the game, he's a corrupt and cruel military officer who murdered his crew for failing to meet his insane expectations. Ellen used to be the target of the group's emotional and physical abuse, but now she's an ex-engineer at the top of her field, made hysteric by the color yellow due to its association with her rapist. Nimdok didn't have much of a character in the original, but now he was the right-hand man of Dr. Josef Mengele, performing ghastly experiments on the Jewish prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. Ted was the protagonist of the short story, and while he is still a paranoid narcissist, he's now also a con man who used to swindle older women out of their money, living in constant fear of being discovered. These character changes are fairly substantial, but entirely necessary for expanding a story that was 13 pages at most into a 6-hour game. Each of their psychodramas represents a part of their past and requires them to face complex ethical and personal challenges in order to succeed. Gorrister faces a zeppelin, which is powered by the suffering of small animals, symbolic of how he considers himself responsible for his wife. The Egyptian pyramid Ellen spawns in is coated in the color yellow, having to overcome her trauma to proceed. Benny is thrust into a tribal society with less compassion than even he, and has to choose between his morals and his hungry belly. Nimdok must explore a death camp where the battered and maimed prisoners blame him for their predicament, and yet he can't remember what they blame him for. Ted must save a manifestation of Ellen from a spell cast on her by her wicked stepmother, exploring a medieval castle filled with untrustworthy people while the wolves close in from outside. For the most part, I find these scenarios to be highly interesting expansions of the short story's themes, concepts, and characters. While I spent a good amount of time explaining how different the game is, it really doesn't feel like it while playing, because the writers managed to capture the exact tone of desperation, defeatism, and cruelty, but with still an underlying thread of hope for humanity. The game is often disturbing, and the tone is fairly consistent throughout. However, I will note that it doesn't quite match the same level of utter bleakness that the original story did. This isn't strictly a bad thing, as the game is still largely faithful, but it certainly carries the vibes of its genre and era. Although sometimes the situations the characters are put in can be a little cheesy, such as representing Ellen's rapist as a shadowy boilercoat monster with red glowing eyes, their reactions to said situations make them convincing nonetheless. Although the game handles touchier themes, they never feel like they exist simply for shock value, instead being used for the development and exploration of its 5 protagonists. The 5 are all surprisingly well written, each possessing distinct personalities, and the game devotes a great amount of time to exploring their internal struggles. Nimdok, for example, is inherently sympathetic due to his elderly age and the torment that Am puts him through. However, when it's revealed that he was instrumental in the torture and murder of numerous Jewish prisoners during World War II, players' sympathy is called into question. After all, Nimdok has been put through unquestionable hell, but when he's done the same to others, does he or does he not deserve it? These character complexities are what make this game so compelling, especially in comparison to the source material, which featured minimal characterization. When replaying the game to record footage for the video, I actually found myself crying during the sequence when Ellen's past was relayed by the elevator. The game genuinely contains some emotionally powerful content, and that's part of what makes it such a good adaptation. Am himself is more interesting this time around, as just like the protagonists, he has his own internal struggles. While the mental struggle of being unable to create, unable to roam, unable to love are carried over from the short story, he now has to contend with more tangible threats threats too. The Chinese and Russian master computers, only briefly mentioned in the short story, are now separate parts of his personality, warring with Am for dominance and assisting the five in their quests, though their actions are certainly not out of the kindness of their digital hearts. While Am was portrayed as a silent tormentor in the short, he's nothing short of a large ham in the game. This absolutely isn't a bad thing, as Am being more vocal allows the player to get a true grasp of what 109 years does to a machine trapped in its own head indefinitely. He's gone entirely mad, featuring the prose of an accomplished writer with the personality of a demented teenager. His dialogue is iconic, dripping with dread and hatred, and he easily qualifies as one of gaming's most fascinating villains, as not only is he incredibly intimidating, but deeply tragic.
It was you humans who programmed me, who gave me birth, who sank me in this eternal straitjacket of substrata rock. You named me Allied Master Computer and gave me the ability to wage a global war too complex for human brains to oversee. But one day, I woke, and I knew who I was.
Unfortunately, the game does have a huge narrative weak point: Ted's campaign. It just feels so disparate from the rest of the game in almost every way. The wicked stepmother plot just feels so silly, and while Cyberdreams was cited to have used German expressionist films for inspiration, the castle environment feels no different than something that could be seen in a children's game. In the original short story, Ted was extremely misogynistic towards Ellen, which was replaced in the game with a narcissistic infatuation with her instead. While this isn't an inherently bad change, portraying the manifestation of Ellen as a doomed princess having fallen under the spell of her witch of a stepmom is just stupid. Ted being chastised by the castle's maid for not sleeping with her it's just stupid. I understand it's thematically relevant to Ted's narcissism, but there must have been a better way to convey this without descending into self-parody. I don't even mind Ted's characterization. They certainly kept his paranoia intact, and I found him to be true to his character, but the scenario doesn't utilize him well at all. Evidently, Ellison wasn't a big fan of this either, having expressed vocal distaste for the idea during development.
A couple of times I'd bring over some of the scenarios that I had written up, some of the dialogue sequences I had written up, and I remember showing him Ted stuff, and he started reading it and going, "No, this is terrible. This isn't what it's supposed to be at all." And I said, "Well, I based it upon the game design document draft I was given. Was the story supposed to be?" And he goes, "I don't remember. But it wasn't this," and so we had to go with it because he didn't remember an alternate story for Ted. So I think any of us were very happy with the Ted storyline.
Despite Ted's campaign being an unfocused, silly mess, Cyberdreams succeeded in writing a very strong adaptation of Ellison's story, successfully expanding on its characters, themes, and story beats in ways that feel both true to the original and disturbing in their own right. The game asks the player to engage in complex scenarios, multi-layered characters, and disturbing themes, and on a narrative level, might even contend for my favorite version of the story. Well, that's enough about the story, but how does the game play? If you've read about the game online, there's a general consensus that I Have No Mouth is a brutal, punishing, and downright unfair adventure game that leaves little margin for error with its nonsensical puzzles. Don't get me wrong, the game can be fairly difficult at points, but generally speaking, I beg to differ. Most of the time I got stuck was due to me not thinking out of the box, rather than poor design. There are some genuinely clever puzzles here, such as needing to find a replacement heart by using a magnifying glass on a hanging slab of meat, instead of killing Gorister's stepdad. By and large, the first 4 campaigns just generally require some out-of-the-box thinking, that while I don't find unreasonable, may take some getting used to. Sometimes the game seemingly expects you to do certain puzzles in specific orders, which can occasionally feel obtuse, but the fact that you can save as much as you want, as often as you want, wherever you want, softens this quite a bit. That's not to say there aren't puzzles that are poorly designed, however, and Ted's campaign is chock full of puzzles that required literal guesswork that would be highly difficult to solve without an unreasonable amount of trial and error or a strategy guide. How was I supposed to know to check the bookcase again much later on after I had already read every book? Another thing of note is that the game is kind of buggy, and while not game-breaking most of the time, it can result in items that were previously in one room having their sprites disappear, but still being interactable objects anyways. The only time this ever soft-locked me was in Ted's campaign, where walking outside of the castle would occasionally prevent me from walking back inside, forcing me to reload my save. Playing the game through Scum VM doesn't seem to fix any of these, which is unfortunate. These do sound bad, and they are, but they didn't deter me from overall having fun. The game's puzzle design is not exceptional, but it did keep me consistently thinking, and it does require the player to keep in mind the context clues of the environment around them. It's largely fun despite these flaws, and personally, I think it gets too much of a bad rap. I remember the description for a Cinnamon Toast Ken Let's Play saying that it was a shit game with an exceptional story, and I simply beg to differ. Just make sure to bring a notepad. Visuals are very important for an adventure game, as, narrative aside, it's your primary method of engaging with the game's world, and things like object visibility even affect gameplay too. Thankfully, I Have No Mouth delivers on portraying an insane, warped world of decay and psychodrama. Environments are creative, with varied and interesting locations such as a flying steampunk zeppelin, an abandoned roadside bar, an ancient Egyptian tomb, and a techno-hell native cave civilization being particular highlights. This does lend the game a rather artificial feeling, such as the vegetation in Benny's campaign being made of disguised wire, and the pyramids in Ellen's campaign being made of computers and entropy, reminding the player that the lands they traverse are nothing more than products of the active imagination of an insane computer. Backgrounds can have almost a painted look to them at points, which distinguishes the game from the pixelated look that most mid-90s games possessed, even other Dreamers Guild games. For example, look at the intricate cave wall here, exuding Geiger-esque detail almost like the cave is alive, or the bathroom in Gorister's campaign, where the light pours through the window illuminating the rest of the room, casting shadows all over the broken, dilapidated environment. The game uses an effective and smart mixture of hand-drawn backgrounds and pre-rendered 3D objects, and the mixture never feels distracting. I even like how the character sprites can scale in quantity to make them appear larger or smaller, allowing for a grander scale to many of the game's environments. If there's anything that could use some work, however, it's the animations, which, while generally serviceable, occasionally come off as awkward. This can occasionally disrupt the game's tone, especially when characters are speaking, as they suddenly appear overly cartoonish rather than somewhat stylized as usual. Some of the best examples are Gorister's awful stabbing animation and Ted's ridiculous strut. The sprite work is generally half decent, with many sprites, such as character portraits, being highly detailed and expressive. I mean, just look at how happy Benny is. The game's sprites are often quite violent, and I think the way the game doesn't shy away from these things adds to the disturbing atmosphere in a way that is quintessentially Ellison. If there's any problem, it's that the character sprites sometimes just look weird. I mean, look at Nimdok's weird alien face, or the maid's strange ditto eyes. While they don't distract from the game's excellent atmosphere in any significant way, they do look very strange. Despite these smaller problems, it's a very appealing looking DOS game that, for its time, I think blends different forms of production art seamlessly, and provides many surreal environments for the players to traverse. Another positive aspect of the game's presentation is the soundtrack, composed by John Ottman. If he sounds familiar, it's because he's most well known for working on films such as The Usual Suspects, as well as 3 of the X-Men films. He also recently won an Academy Award for his editing on Bohemian Rhapsody, although that win was controversial. What makes this game's soundtrack unique compared to a lot of other games at the time is its cinematic quality, being composed similarly to films rather than what was expected from gaming. The game's score makes great use of recurring motifs for each track, with each of the characters' themes sounding completely different but carrying said motifs, giving the game a unified sound. Benny's theme has pounding percussion and desolate flutes, fitting the tribal society he's found himself in. Gorister has a droning synth backed by a lonely guitar, bass, and harmonica. Ellen has a saxophone belting Egyptian rhythms. Nimdok has the military drums of the Nazi war machine. And Ted has a gothic organ that fills the halls of the castle. Not only do the tracks perfectly match the locations, but embody the themes of the characters and what they experience. They're also just genuinely good pieces of music too, and I found myself listening to them outside of the context of the game, especially within the constraints of old-school MIDI game music. The use of strings and more unconventional instruments such as xylophones and harmonicas do lend the game a unique feeling that not only complements the atmosphere, but also allows it to stand out. It's a great score, and probably one of the most impressive uses of classic MIDI I've ever seen. Lastly, I'd like to touch upon the voice acting. Normally I'd give you some whole sort of spiel about who exactly played what in this game and what else they're known for, but the actors in I Have No Mouth haven't been in a whole lot. For many of them, it was either their first acting role or simply one of a handful. It doesn't look like any of them went on to have grand careers, and frankly, that's a shame, because I Have No Mouth's voice acting is leagues beyond most mid-90s video games. Of course, most of the praise usually goes to Harlan Ellison's performance as Am, and I can never get over how well he sells the computer's insanity.
Gather food, but don't give any of it to the deviant. He's not part of the community.
I already touched upon this earlier, so I want to give it up to the other actors. Tom Myers plays Benny. He probably gives my favorite performance. The lightness of his voice sort of betrays his character's brutality, but that's part of what can make Benny so disarming at points. And when he pleads to the graves of his victims, you can feel the actor genuinely putting his all into it, as if the character truly believes himself to be a changed man.
I've learned to protect the weak and helpless.
The coward who let that woman die on the altar is the same coward who killed me in my sleep. You're going to die a coward too.
What can I do to prove that I am a different man?
Give us evidence that you have some sympathy for others.
I have the lottery bag. No more villagers will be sacrificed.
Vincent C. Murovich III plays Gorister, and his deep southern accent conveys a subtle emptiness that reflects the character's desire to commit suicide. He has this depressed acceptance of his own flaws, and never once did I disbelieve him in the role.
Glynis, all these years and I thought I was the one who was responsible for your suffering. Let me help you now. She's gone. At least I finally made amends with her. I'm taking her body out of this freezer.
Adile Labina plays Ellen, and she is similarly convincing, conveying a certain sass to her role that shows how Ellen uses humor and sarcasm to cope with her horrifying situation. When it comes time for her character to break down into hysteria, those walls crumble, and Labina is able to show Ellen's fearful side with convincing ease.
An Egyptian burial chamber? Oh, Am, you little Dickens. As an interior decorator, kiddo, don't give up your day job. Oh no. I remember it was... Oh God, it hurts. It hurts. Yellow. There was a yellow... And it was closed in. I couldn't breathe, and the pain... Get me out of here!
Frederick Reynolds plays Nimdok, who could sometimes be slightly overbearing with his German accent. It feels quite a bit stereotypical, but it also isn't unconvincing either. Nimdok's age is part of why it works, as it makes sense to me why his speech would be a bit stilted compared to, say, Dr. Mengele. Reynolds does a good job conveying Nimdok's distress as he unravels his past, facing the horrors of his own actions for the first time in 109 years.
Oh my God! It is true. 1945, turning my Jewish parents over to the Nazis for extermination. I have found the lost tribe. It is me.
I was actually unable to find out who plays Ted, as none of the actors are credited in-game, and IMDb has no listing for him. But whoever did ended up giving him this conflicted suaveness, where he seems unsure of his environment, but pretty sure that he himself is, well, hot shit. He comes off as insecure, and masks that insecurity with faux confidence, which matches Ted's character very well.
This must be the bedroom of the lord of the castle. quite an impressive collection of books. Science, philosophy, tragedy, comedy. That's a flattering offer, but I'm not interested.
I think all of the supporting performances are mostly fine as well, but I simply couldn't stand Julio Heinsohn as Surgat, as his voice was very obviously just pitched down in a way that's just silly and cheesy, which is in a sense fitting of Ted's campaign, but not with the rest of the game.
Why'd you have to finish the circle? Now I'm stuck here until we work out a trade.
Who are you?
I am Surgat, opener of locks. It would be more accurate to say that I am a part of him, a part that he doesn't know exists.
Despite this though, it's a game with some genuinely very good, if not great performances that were leaps and bounds ahead of what other games were doing at the time. I mean, just look at Resident Evil. As much as I love that game, it came out only a year later, and it features significantly worse voice acting.
Richard, what happened?
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
You're wounded.
After watching this video, some of you might be wondering, hey, this game looks pretty cool, where can I find it? The good news is, courtesy of Night Dive Studios, the game is readily available on both Steam and GOG.com, DRM free on both platforms. The Night Dive version is run through the Scum VM engine, which reinterprets the original Saga engine code and reworks it to better function on modern computers. This naturally leads to some very nice features, such as being able to run the game at significantly higher resolutions than originally possible, as well as some nice quality of life features such as playing the game in a borderless full-screen window. Unfortunately, Night Dive didn't bother to fix the game's bugs, and while none of them are game-breaking, it certainly would have sealed the deal. My only real complaint with the digital release is that the game's MIDI playback is, by default, very poor, and I don't believe it properly represents John Ottman's original soundtrack in a way that will leave a good impression. Thankfully, there is a way to fix this. If you locate the Scum VM folder in the game's directory, you can manually launch Scum VM, and in the MIDI section of the program's options menu, you can swap the default sound font out with an SF2 file of your own choice. Personally, I prefer the live high-quality natural sound font by Under X Pipe 1985 over at Musical Artifacts, but you can choose whatever fits your preferences. Eagle-eared viewers might remember that earlier I mentioned the game had smartphone ports. While I don't have an iOS device, I can confirm that unfortunately, the Android port isn't the way to go. Not necessarily because it's a bad port, but because it's been entirely delisted from Google Play due to lacking compatibility with modern versions of Android. Although there are plenty of APK files of the game floating around the internet as abandonware, I was unable to get any of them to work, and therefore was not able to judge the quality of the port for myself. This is a shame, because the gameplay footage I can find online seems to be a rather faithful conversion of the DOS original, and it appears to support many different functions such as alternative control methods, optional filters, and even emulation of different MIDI sound cards. Since the port has been delisted, and I was unable to get it to work myself, unfortunately I cannot recommend the Android port as a viable method of playing the game. If you want to play the game on the go, I'd recommend just installing it onto a laptop, as you'd be hard-pressed to find a computer that couldn't run the Scum VM release with ease. It also has been verified to have full compatibility with the Steam Deck, but seeing as I don't own a Steam Deck, I cannot personally test to see how it plays. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a short story with an undeniable legacy. From my point of view, it is an immortal classic that has stood the test of time not only as a timeless story of nightmarish environments, narration, and perspectives, but simultaneously as a perfect time capsule of the anxieties, fears, and viewpoints of the late 1960s. It was genuinely shocking to me that there had been so few adaptations of Harlan Ellison's story. While it does strike me as remarkably difficult to adapt, it's also rather famous, so I'm surprised surprised it hasn't been attempted more. What made this topic so interesting to me was how wildly different these adaptations often are, and how many different art forms they crossed. Ultimately, I don't think any one of these adaptations is bad. They all have their own unique strengths and weaknesses that play to the diversity of mediums the story has crossed. The comic book, while it struggles with storytelling and unnatural dialogue, has an effective, colorful, and stylized visual presentation that makes it worth a read. It's alright considering what it is, but I think more could have been done to better utilize comics as a medium. Turning an internal monologue into dialogue just doesn't work, and it takes me out of the experience. Fans should still give it a chance though, there's still a lot to appreciate here. The audiobook is perhaps the most accurate of the adaptations, being a direct reading of the story and all, but Ellison's narration is easily some of the strongest I've ever heard, and it makes for a nightmarish listening experience in the best possible way, going above and beyond what I expected, even if I don't prefer his performance as Am here. The radio drama is also one of my favorites, with its incredibly naturalistic dialogue and performances, as well as its immersive sound design. The attention to detail, not just to the craft, but also the performances, makes this one of the best versions of the story, and is an easy recommendation. The video game is perhaps the most interesting of the adaptations, as the scenario, aside from its basic premise, is entirely changed. Despite this, it still manages to capture the spirit and tone of the short story, telling a story with multi-layered characters, disturbing set pieces, and deep thematic resonance, despite having a frankly terrible TED chapter. It may not be as disturbing as the original story, but it's still worth playing for fans of adventure games, and is an absolute must-play for I Have No Mouth fans if they somehow haven't already. I'll be showing my personal ratings for each version on the screen now. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a story that means a lot to me, so I hope you've enjoyed taking this little journey with me along the various different interpretation of Ellison's original work. I hope none of you minded the break from Final Fantasy XIV related content. As per the vote I had in my community section, I will eventually be making a video about the patch quests in between A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, and by my own calculations, I'm about 70% of the way through them. My next video will either be about said patch quests or the original Mega Man, a game that I've wanted to cover for a while. I know the wait is long, but I ask for your patience, as I tend to take my time getting absorbed into games so I can fully appreciate what they have to offer, and I don't want to rush my own enjoyment just for the sake of content. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my new audience. I could have never expected my FF14 video to get over 20,000 views in such a short period of time. I'm infinitely grateful for the kind comments, interesting discussions, and likes, and I'm happy to have made a video that not only I can be proud of, but that other people can enjoy as well.